medium. It's a world of real animals living in software. Instead of playing a pre-made animation, creatures swim bound by the laws of physics. They apply torque at their joints to...
Okay, we should be live. Hello everyone, if you are you're watching. If you've got any questions throughout this, if you just drop them in the kind of chat box and we'll be free to answer them. Just as a bit of an introduction, my name's Dan, I'm the community manager for Slug Disco, the publisher of Ecosystem, and with me is Tom, the developer. He's a solo dev on Ecosystem. Do you want to just introduce yourself, Tom, and talk about the game a little bit and kind of what Ecosystem is?
Sure. Hello everyone. I'm Tom. I'm the developer of Ecosystem, and the premise of Ecosystem is that you build an environment, and then these sort of fully simulated virtual creatures adapt to the different niches in the environment. So it's kind of a life simulator and an evolution simulator first and foremost. And so I'll sort of, what I thought I'd do for this playthrough is just kind of do a fresh playthrough from the start and kind of just talk through everything as I run into it, like explain how things work and the ideas behind the game, and even maybe some of the like underlying concepts behind it, sort of like how it works under the hood.
Okay, great. Yeah, so do you want to just, I guess, just go through the motions and start a new game?
Yeah, sounds good. So when you start a new game, the first thing you see is the terrain generator. And so basically this allows you to change the large scale properties of the environment. So there's like a couple presets that you can see, like a cliffs, a beach, sort of like an abyssal plain, a deep sea trench, and kind of like a lagoon sort of area. And then also you can kind of shift these sliders, and I think pretty much anything kind of works as a terrain. Almost any sort of possible combination will produce something kind of interesting. And so these sort of environmental effects, like even if we just sort of choose random things, you often will come up with kind of interesting little environments. And so this environment will actually affect what kinds of creatures, even at this sort of really high level phase, this will affect what kinds of creatures can evolve, or like what will be favored by evolution. So like if you have a very dark kind of environment, like a deep sea area, that might lend itself to predators that can exploit that low visibility, like creatures that kind of lurk in the dark and ambush prey. And similarly, if you have like a flat area as opposed to a more like sort of jagged, rocky one with a lot of spikes and stuff, it might be beneficial for creatures to be kind of small and agile if there's a lot of crags and spikes that they need to sort of maneuver around quickly, especially if you're like a forager that needs to stay away from predators.
Yeah, and you can see that there's there was a section there, browse terrain online, because we've got workshop support in the game, don't we?
Yeah, so we can open up, so we can look at sort of everything that anybody's uploaded, and you can make your own stuff and upload that too. And there's a lot of cool things that people have done. So one of the most common ones. So this is one that I made that just comes a pre-made level with caves, where you have like a cave network, for example, and creatures are smart enough to sort of path around caves, and if you dig out crevices and stuff like that, they can figure that out. A lot of these areas I think are quite cool. So these are by stobs, and there's quite a few players who figured out a way to kind of who basically sort of hacked the game to get the camera up above the water level, which you're not even really supposed to be able to do. But they figured out a way to do that, and then evolved creatures up there, and we're actually able to get them to evolve to walk, which I'm really happy about. I think that was actually a super cool thing, and was kind of surprised myself that it even sort of worked so well, that the creatures that I had not even really tested very much with regard to walking were actually at least sort of able to do that if you put a lot of time and effort into it.
Yeah, because primarily Ecosystem, well, not I say primarily, it is solely, at the moment, it is all underwater, and it's going to stay that way. There may, I know we've spoken about previously, if anyone knows the game or follows it, that, you know, down the line, kind of possibly, it's kind of work in progress, there may be crustaceans, but it is more about just creatures and swimming and that kind of simulation. So yeah, Stobbs is just shout out to Stobbs for being such a really good member of the community. He's always helping on Discord. Yeah, and he's created what he calls Lish, which are the land fish, which you can play around with the workshop, but it's not like a feature of the game, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and interestingly, even like the fact that the sort of the water physics even turns off when you get up to the surface is mostly something that I coded in, just specifically so that there might be a little niche of creatures for ones that swim close to the top. You know, essentially like a very surface dwelling kind of creatures, and so it's just sort of a happy coincidence that if you actually manage to get the land to go all the way up there, you can get something that sort of walks or kind of hops.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, if you want to, I guess just jump into a world and let's start making an ecosystem.
Yeah, that sounds good. So one of the things that we just added in was a Terraform option. And so the cool thing about it is it lets you do pretty like large scale changes to the environment. A lot of the most interesting sort of niches in nature are, of course, are where two different types of environments kind of collide. You know, like places where a stream, a river runs into the ocean, or even in a sense, the fact that nature is so active at twilight and at dawn is kind of a sort of a collision of two ecosystems, you know. And so that was something that I wanted to support and have wanted to support for a while. And so this is just kind of like a nice, easy way if you want to add in like sort of different types of terrains. Like, so I picked kind of a strange, almost kind of alien-looking world for this one. But like, if we wanted to add in a little area that's sort of like the beach. That was on the start screen, I can do that, and you can see that now we have kind of like an alien area that actually also has sort of like a beach that runs from the top, middle to the right.
Yeah, and this was quite a requested feature, wasn't it? Which,
yeah.
You know, the game is in early access, and it's for things like this. It's when people were creating the maps, they wanted just a little bit more variation. Which I think this has been quite really good, well received sort of update, especially the large brush sizes to do things on a slightly bigger scale.
Yeah, we'd previously had options for sort of small scale things, like if you want to just make like sort of like sculptures and stuff, like these kinds of little brushes are good for that. But you need something a little bit larger scale in order to make big changes. You can also change the watercolor in areas. So like if we want this beach to be a little bit more of like a light blue sort of color, that also should work. And then we can see that like, so while we're here over the beach, it'll be blue, but as I move the camera back over to the alien region, it kind of fades back over to the sort of purplish color that we started with. So to get started kind of with like the game part of the game, you begin with plants, which is sort of, you know, the base of the food chain. So I'll just pick a few to sort of start out. Maybe.
So the kind of core loop,
and so,
from where you start, because you saw them, you were unlocking certain plants. As you go along, you'll earn more sort of research points to then buy more plants and kind of upgrade your ecosystem. Kind of that way, isn't it? That's how you start to design the kind of like flora of the world.
Yeah, it's almost in a way it's kind of like it's both sort of like the core game loop and it's also in some ways like a way to kind of model like ecological succession a little bit. Is this sort of concept of like ecosystem health, basically. And so the idea is that some plants are pioneers and they can grow anywhere. But every plant kind of shifts the environment a little bit, and that may make it more suitable for other plants or even sort of rivals. And so every plant adds to the ecosystem health based on the traits in the environment. And so you can see that for some of these, like this Java Fern, for example, it likes to grow on outcroppings. And we can kind of see that here. Like if I want to put it here in this kind of like little, this sort of silty area, it adds 3 to the ecosystem health. But if I manage to stick it right at the peak of this thing, it will add 8 to it. And so in a sense, and others are more complicated than that. They score off of other plants, or even once you get creatures, it starts scoring off of other creatures, like mushrooms. Like if creatures have died, then their nutrients kind of go into the soil, and mushrooms add more points if they're around places where a lot of creatures have died, basically. And so in a sense, it's kind of like you're managing a chaotic system. Like the environments are healthy when there's more variety, but also each is kind of trying to take over on its own. So you're kind of trying to manage it into something that's either stable or something that's at least kind of self-replicating a little bit. And there's also sort of like a puzzle element where you're trying to manage the eco health. And so we can see here that like we get these life points that come as you improve the ecosystem health, and they let you unlock new plants. So like here I've unlocked either a starfish, another type of pondweed, or a hydrilla. And so the hydrilla, for example, they score off of each other. All the plants are based on real plants, and hydrilla in nature are often, in a lot of places, are sort of invasive. I know that around like Florida, they're like a bit of a problem. I think they might have gotten into the water supply from like aquariums and stuff, possibly, or just shipments that spilled. And so they have a tendency to take over and wipe out like native plants, and it can be a bit of an issue because they do like to sort of take over, and so that's sort of reflected in game because they score off of each other essentially, and you can see that here when I hover over, we see all these little like plus 1/4. That's how much it will add to the ecosystem if you put it down there. So they like to form like a single community. But in general in the game, like the more different species of plants you can pack into an area, the higher the ecosystem health that you'll have, the higher that will be. And so ecosystem actually has a full plant simulation. And sort of like what I mean for that is that each plant is actually individually simulated. Every species of plant has its own preference for like soil type and sunlight, and they have different requirements for the ecosystem health that they need. Like so, this seaweed that I've selected right now can't be put down over here because it needs the pioneer plants to have kind of already done a little bit of work for it. Yeah, essentially. And so the idea is basically that every plant you can kind of see it. Every plant is like a little replicator. You can actually see it. I don't know how well it comes across, but you can actually see the plants shooting out little seeds. And so they age on their own, they reproduce on their own, and they die on their own. And the amount of success they have, like how long they live and how many seeds they shoot out, are sort of depending on like how good of a fit it is for its environment.
Yeah, and so the plants, obviously that's the kind of, like you said, it's the sort of start of the food chain. So then after that, it's all about starting to actually like get the sort of aquatic life up and running, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the heart of the game is the creatures. It's sort of like the core idea. And so I'll spawn in some right now, and we can kind of just watch them as I sort of talk a little bit about how they work. So the creatures, and really the whole game, was inspired by some research that was done back in the 90s at MIT by a guy named Carl Sims. And at the time, he was working on like supercomputers. So he would run a simulation on supercomputers over a period of weeks. But we've now reached the point where this is the kind of thing you can do on a desktop computer. And so the basic idea is that we have this sort of concept of a creature, and a creature sort of under the hood is like a bunch of boxes joined together, a bunch of rigid body boxes, and they're just joined together randomly, and then on top of that they have virtual brains, and these brains are sort of like pipeline computers that take in like visual input and auditory input. And then they do some processing on it, and then at the end they spit out an output, which is a torque that is applied at the joint. And so the idea, like the core concept of the game, basically is, and of his research, is that you take a bunch of these creatures, and you just make them completely randomly, and you throw them in the water. And so, like, most of them will just flail around. Like, if I sort of look, we've got a few that are actually starting to swim a little bit, but most of them are just kind of are still or kind of flailing a little bit. But a few of them flail in a way that actually lets them move a little bit. And so the ones that move the furthest get to have children. They have more children, and the ones that don't move at all don't get to have any children. And then, in addition, when they reproduce, they mutate a little bit, and they also, like, their DNA can be mixed with other successful creatures. And so, like, after enough generations, you actually have creatures that can swim. And so, like, I can look. You can actually, there's a visualization of the brains here, where you can kind of see how everything works. And I think one of the most unique things about ecosystem is that the water and the motion are fully simulated. So, like, none of the creatures are playing like a pre-made animation. They actually are physically swimming, in a sense. Like, they move the way that we move. So, like, neuron inputs flow down to muscle outputs that contract muscles. I can see if I can find another creature that has a different a different brain. Might also spawn in another creature here somewhere too.
People may have just very briefly saw then that you can, like, kind of watch through the eyes of the creature and sort of follow it around.
Yeah. So every time that you select a creature, you get a little info panel about it, and you get to sort of see through its eyes. There's two ways that you can kind of follow creatures. So there's a neuron view, which we see here. And the way this works is basically, so these are the pipeline computers that I was kind of talking about. So we both get to see the creature as it swims. This one just died. So we go to the nearest creature of the same species. So we kind of see them follow around. You can also just set this to like a kind of a follow camera. Like, if you just want to sort of relax, you can just set it on a creature and just sort of watch as it goes about its life, as it feeds and reproduces and then dies. And then when it dies, the camera sort of passes on to the next one. So in a way, it can also be kind of like a relaxing little, almost like a screensaver. And I do find it kind of relaxing. So,
yeah,
like, here
a lot
we've
of
kind
people,
switched
because
over.
obviously you can speed up the simulation time and stuff, but I do hear quite a lot from people in the community that they'll set it all up and just leave it on kind of in the background while they, like, watch a show or listen to a podcast, and it's just that kind of, you can play it either quite actively with the boosting of the creatures and spawning them and saving them and creating your own creatures, or you can just leave it kind of running and just sort of see what happens. I've had quite a lot of people say they've left it on overnight and checked it again like 8-9 hours later in the morning, and it's just everything sort of changed.
Yeah, when I started work on the game, actually, the creatures would take like a whole day often just to evolve to swim. So like, I would start with a population of 20 or something like that. It looked totally different back then, but it would often take like hours and hours and hours just to get to the point where creatures would be able to swim. And a lot of that sort of came down to the kind of meta parameters of the universe that govern how swimming works and how creatures evolve and how their brains function and stuff like that. One of the things that I like about it is that since it's such a physically focused game, it really is a case of like function kind of driving form. Like, so the creatures' bodies really are sort of shaped by evolution and the physics of swimming. So it's not just a matter of like how things look or even like of scores, but like of how, like, what's a good way to swim. And that's sort of what actually drives how things look, which is how it works in nature too.
Yeah. So just jumping in, just anyone who's watching, if you do have any sort of questions about the development of the game, or questions just for Tom, kind of, his interest, his background, just let us know in the comments. Yeah, it's always, I was noticed when you were watching those fish and they kept on dying out, it was always a bit sad when you're like, oh yes, this fish looks really cool, and you start following it and then it just slowly fades away. It's not really made for it.
That is. Yeah, that is kind of a problem. If they're very successful, they can often keep going. But inevitably, usually successful creatures also tend to have children, and eventually their children will sort of surpass them too. So even though in theory a creature could sort of live forever, in practice they don't. The immature ones especially don't live very long. So in this version of the game, they live for 30 seconds. I'm actually going to change that to a minute in the next build, just so that you have a little bit more time. You don't, because especially when they're very young like this, when they're immature species, you really you see them and then they die kind of a lot of times. And so part of the reason for that is that the immature species are still kind of just learning to swim. That's sort of like their one job. The idea is in a sense, like the environmental explanation is that they're kind of feeding off the algae in the water. But the sort of core of it is that they just need to move, to a sense. And once a creature matures, then they reach a point where they need to start steering, where they need to start aiming for plants, and or once at some point I'll start putting in some predators where you start aiming for other creatures, or even at the level beyond that, apex predators that eat predators. So they live a bit longer. They start to live for about 3 minutes a cycle. But that's when it starts to get maybe a little bit more interesting in terms of creatures interacting with each other and doing things, and it's a little easier to watch one and get adapted to it. You can also kind of trace out. So one of the first update that we did was for these info views. And so this sort of gives you a really high level of the creatures. So here we can see all the different species and how they've grown or died off in the plants down here. And then also for each individual species, we can kind of look at a family tree of it. So if you get attached to a creature, you can actually look and see, you can kind of follow its lineage to some extent. And on top of that, it also sort of traces the mutations, so you can even really kind of actually see how evolution works in practice. Like we can see that this creature, Georgiana, had 3 mutations. It had a body connection moved, a neural connection changed, and a neuron added. And as a result of that, it had quite a bit more success than the other sort of creatures at the same time, and got to have 3 children, whereas a lot of them didn't have any, or if you had one. And there's a couple different branches of the family tree out here that died off. The green ones here are the ones that are still alive, essentially. So you can see the branches that are. So we actually had a marked sort of a chain, a little evolutionary species that kind of started out here. That's pretty substantial, but has now actually kind of dwindled to the point of being one. So almost all the creatures that are alive now are either descendants of this creature, who was a descendant of the original spawned one. With a neural connection change that made it swim a little bit more efficiently, or are a connection of this one, Claudia, who had a body connection shifted, who just had a fin moved a little bit. And so that gives you a way to actually sort of really see the evolution. And then you can also change some things in here too, you can adjust the mutation rate on the creature if you want. You can set this all the way up to 10 if you want things to really change quickly or really wildly change. And you can also adjust things like this is a sort of a soft population cap that prevents a single species from sort of just taking over. That sort of gives you a slightly easier way to manage the populations without, because if you turn the population caps off entirely, it is something where you really have to watch and make sure that one single thing doesn't just take over. And the same thing on the low end. You can set a predation limit where a predator will no longer target sort of endangered species, basically.
Okay, we've had a couple of comments. So TS Royal says, "Hi, awesome concept for a game. Is it only Tom working on this game? Yeah, you're a solo dev, right?"
Yeah. So I do. I'm also working on the game full time. There is a friend of mine does the score for it, and there were some artists that I worked with who made sort of on a contract level. They made heads and the procedural materials for the skins. But I'm the only person working on the game sort of full time. So I'm the one waking up every day just working on it all the time. So it is very much like a solo project and sort of like a single person passion project that I've been working on for quite a while.
as a follow-up to that, he said, they said, do you have a systems biology / modeling background? So I guess how did you come to be developing games and ecosystems specifically?
Yeah, so I don't actually. So I'm actually came from, so at university I was very much math focused. In fact, I studied math. That's what my master's is in. And then as a job, I actually worked in the games industry. So I worked at a bigger game company for a while, a studio named Terminal Reality. They did the most famous one that we worked on there was the Ghostbusters game. I forget what year that was, like 2000, late 2000s or so. The one
One
with
of the 3D ones.
Yeah, the one where I was quite happy with it because they actually got Bill Murray and Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis and they got everybody to come back to do the voices, and so I was quite happy with that, and Ernie Hudson, and I think it was one of the last ones before Harold Ramis I think passed away. But I very much came from it as just like a game programmer. I was on the engine side, so I mostly did like sort of engine level work. But I had seen these videos that Carl Sims made back in the 90s, and I just sort of always remembered them. You can find them on YouTube. They're great videos to watch. They're really entertaining and interesting, and it's fascinating that he was able to make them and make them work back then. They're really incredible and fun to watch. And it just sort of came to me. That company eventually went out of business, as a lot of companies, the mid-sized companies. A lot of them kind of struggled around that era. There was kind of a period where the medium-sized companies kind of died off, and it became very much like huge, mega-sized companies and very small solo developers, basically. And so I became one of the solo developers, and I made a game after that, like kind of like a totally different from Ecosystem, a tactics game called Enemy. That was inspired a little bit by the original XCOM, the 1992 XCOM. And then after that, I just moved on to this because I was so sort of enamored with the concept. It's been a really fun game to work on, partially because it's so different. Like it's not there's not like a best practices for like an evolution game, really, So it's involved a lot of experimentation and trying to figure things out.
Yeah. Okay, and then the other questions from Nick Gilberto. Is there any work being done to help with optimization? So obviously the physics sort of element to it is it can be sometimes quite heavy to run, depending on if you don't put any sort of limits or the soft caps in place. I guess it's just an ongoing thing, though, right?
Yeah, it's something that I've sort of I just sort of come back to every now and then, and I think the performance has improved a lot since like the first day of early access and since the demo and stuff like that. So it's kind of a gradual process. The tricky thing, I think we mentioned that you can actually run it at 2x speed. I can do that really quickly, and make everything. So essentially, the tricky thing about running it at 2x is it really has to process everything at 2x speed. The tricky thing about a game like this, as compared to a lot of other games, is that like if you're playing an RPG or something and you leave a city, they can just turn the city off, right? Like they don't need to even, the city doesn't even need to exist anymore once you're gone, and they just turn it back on when you go in, essentially. But I can't do that with the fish. I can turn off the rendering, so it's certainly not drawing anything that you're not looking at. But they still need to do the entire physics simulation and the neural simulation and the AI, because everything still needs to evolve, even if you're not looking at it. That's kind of, it'd be disappointing if you look away for 6 hours and you turn around and everything just looks exactly the same as it did before.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a difficult optimization problem for that reason. But that sort of like tricky engine level work is something that I've had a lot of experience with, and it's just something that I sort of come back to every now and then. Of course, the tricky thing also is that as the performance get better, what people are often tempted to do is like, well, I'll just spawn in another 50 creatures, So I sort of don't want to put a hard limit, like, and say nobody can spawn in more than 200 or something like that. But every bit of performance, there's always kind of an immediate thing is that, well, I'll put in 300 creatures now, and so there's always kind of like a bit of a race there.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. If you don't have those caps in place, yeah, people can just, start spawning loads. I hadn't actually thought of it in that kind of those terms before. A follow-up from Nick is there any plans to design your own plants or just the creatures?
I've experimented with plants before, and it did kind of work. Like, I came up with sort of a system that does still use the boxes, and it basically sort of scored them based on how much kind of sunlight they got. It was an interesting idea, and it did at least halfway work, and I think something like that could possibly work. But it's sort of on the back burner for me right now. There's a couple reasons why plants are sort of tricky, and one of the biggest ones is that they would need a totally different system for the procedural meshes. So like if I were to add in like crustaceans, or even like if I did something a lot more extreme like land animals or something like that, which I'm not saying I would do. Crustaceans are planned at some point, but they could basically use a lot of the same systems for the procedural meshes, like the skins. The same idea would kind of work essentially, and would just need some tweaks here and there. But the plants would really need like a total sort of a whole rework essentially.
Yeah.
And so for that reason, there's still a couple of big things that I'm planning on working on that I think would add a lot, or that would sort of pay off more in terms of what they would add to the game compared to plants. Like, the next update that we have coming in will focus on giving players a lot more ways to kind of intervene in evolution. So like setting a lot of the meta parameters that right now I can set in code will be sort of like exposed to the players, so that you can really, it'll really be like it's your own evolution sim, where you're kind of shifting not just the environment, but even like the laws of the universe in a sense.
Yeah.
And also ways that'll make it a lot easier to sort of do selective breeding, so that if you want to, you can get really into, this is my species and I'm going to tweak it the way that I want, and then of course later on in the year towards the end, we're hoping to add in like a fighting update that I think will add a lot to the game. Right now everything is very focused on swimming. Swimming speed is very dominant, things like that. But if once we get to the point where like there's this kind of a damage model, then it almost adds like a whole nother dimension that creatures can evolve on, and it should open up a lot of different niches that maybe weren't there before, like being a big, slow, bulky creature with a lot of defenses, rather than being necessarily the fastest creature that always gets to the food first.
Yeah. Do you have any predators in this world yet?
I think, let me check. I might have spawned some in at some point. While we were talking, so I'll just have to check and see. So this one's a forager. This one's a forager. So we have one predator. So this species are predators, and they look like some of them are doing pretty well. So generally, the way it works is as it looks like everyone's kind of mating right now. But basically, creatures go out, and so their life cycle is half spent on feeding and half spent on mating. And so right now it looks like most of the creatures are in kind of a mating phase, but I'll see if I can find some that are looking for food. It looks like the predators are very much mating right now, but I'll point one out once they get back to it. There's 3 different types of mating. I'll just say that now since it's happening. There's 3 different types of mating. So this predator species mates for life. So when creatures mate, they do actually really they do mate in a DNA sense. So like when two creatures pair up and have children, it does actually sort of combine their DNA, and there's a couple different ways it can do that. But it takes the DNA of the 2 parents and then it applies some mutations to their children, and it goes on. There's 3 different types. So this creature is monogamous. They mate for life. Most creatures are generally attracted to creatures that have done well for themselves, essentially, like who've gotten a lot of food in their life. But they also care about things like, let me spawn in some more plants as we talk. So they're attracted to pretty much all creatures are attracted to sort of performing well, getting a lot of food, but they also tend to like things like coloration, bright coloration, and sometimes even things like size and stuff like that. So like, and one thing that you'll see that I think is kind of interesting is like for foragers. There is like there's also like a concept of visibility and camouflage, and we kind of notice here that most of these creatures actually do have adapted to match the color of the water.
Yeah, they're quite dark and speckly, aren't they?
Yeah, so that they very much fit the environment. So when it calculates how visible a creature is, you can even see this displayed. So like, depending on what it depends on what their background is. So if they're against the open water, then they're harder to see if they blend in with that color. But if they're up against stones or green grass, then they might really stand out. Like this one has 100% visibility because it's swimming very close to a bunch of stones. So what you'll often see is if you have nothing but foragers to some extent, it's actually good for them to be sort of bright and colorful. It's a bit like the birds of paradise, you know. But once you introduce a predator, then suddenly it's the opposite, because the last thing you want to be is a really bright, easily detectable prey animal, essentially. So suddenly, very quickly, once you put predators in, a lot of times you'll see the foragers and also the predators start to blend in a lot more with their surroundings because it's a lot more advantageous to be camouflaged.
Do you want to show off some of the creature spawning? So obviously the creature editor, and then also the fact that you can save some creatures to your library and then sort of bring them back in to your world if you find like a specific creature that you really like the look of.
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to do that. So I'll first show off the editor real quick. So this is the editor, and so the way that it works is basically it's a way that allows you to make sort of any creature that you want, and sort of the premise of this is that you shape the body, and then you can spawn it in and let sort of evolution shape its brain. And so I'll just sort of really quickly try to make something. The editor is. So the tricky thing is that you have to kind of when you're making it, so the system kind of it has to almost even think about both DNA and like even how individual parts work. So what I'll try to make maybe here is actually like a little like kind of a little plesiosaur or something like that. I'm not as good at this as some people are. Like at some point, I think when you make a game, you always eventually end up surpassed by your players.
Yeah.
In terms of skill. So I'll try and do this sort of quickly, just to give people an idea of what you could do. So I'll maybe make this I'll make it a predator since we don't have a lot of predators. There's a lot of different heads you can make. Also, there's 10 different ones. I'll try and pick one that's maybe a little bit more suitable for a predator, and then I'll also sort of adjust the skin somewhat. So this one may come out looking a little bit weird because I'm not super good at this, and I'm also trying to be kind of quick.
That looks pretty cool.
And then, so I'll also try to add a couple of some fins for this thing. Let's see. And so, and sorry, there I mirrored the part. So one of the things that's kind of interesting about that is that mirroring isn't just sort of like a convenience function. It's actually something that relates to the DNA also. And so like the fact that these two parts are mirrored, it means that they're actually mirrored at the level of DNA. So like the same DNA literally codes for those two body parts. And that sort of helps to keep those two parts in sync, both in a sense of like neurology, so that like the same neurons. So that when I showed the neurons earlier, those neurons are actually like fully embodied. So it's not just like they have this brain that exists, but every brain sort of exists in a part and controls those parts. So there is actually like a nervous system that runs down into this fin. And so when you mirror it, you kind of ensure that the neurons are also mirrored. And this is also sort of like a temporal thing in addition to a brain thing. So like in the future, if there's like a tentacle that evolves at the end of this fin, it will also evolve at the end of this fin. So it'll sort of keep it mirrored even in its
symmetry.
future evolution. So maybe I'll just really quickly give this thing like a little tail, and then I'll spawn it in. And maybe like a little tail fin or something like that. All right. So I think that'll work. We'll have to see how this one turns out.
I mean, yeah, because there's no guarantee that what you make will be able to survive, is the but that's kind of the fun of it. You can go back and tweak it and redo something.
Yeah. So I'll just spawn that in, and so hopefully they'll and so this actually should also give us a chance to sort of watch how like the early creatures even learn to swim. So we can see that even these have actually, like, these are sort of mature ones, and they swim pretty well. They kind of use these two fins up at the top. It looks like to me kind of for stability, and then they paddle really hard with their tails. And it looks like we can kind of see here that these have already somewhat learned to swim a little bit. Like so he's kind of got he's at least paddling a little bit. He's got his head kind of pointed in a weird way. And so what we kind of see here is just like the very beginnings of how it works. Like he's almost kind of trying to swim a little bit with his neck, and not getting too far. But this one's doing really well because he's kind of at least just by random chance he happened to evolve neurons that paddle with his fins instead of with his his head or his tail or something like that. The green coloration kind of reflects how well this creature's genes are doing compared to the overall population. So if you look and it's green, that kind of means that the creature is likely to end up having more children than it sort of were. Like, in other words, essentially that you should expect to see its traits becoming more common as time goes on. And we can kind of already see that here, that we actually have quite a few of these creatures now paddling the way that the original ones did. And so this is a species of predator. So at some point they should, once they mature, they'll start going after those foragers that we made before.
Yeah.
And this might also be a good time. I can show off the online thing. So I think one of these, the one that I think I was kind of keen to add in. So there's quite a few good ones here. This is a very good, very natural kind of looking creature. And so I'll spawn this in. And there's another one that actually Liam made that I really like quite a bit.
The catfish.
Yeah, I was really impressed. So we had to download this one. It's not stored locally, so it may take a minute since I'm also streaming. And so I was really impressed that, because he basically just tried to make something that looked like a cat, and it worked surprisingly well. But yeah, I always find it fun to watch it learn to swim.
Yeah, there's a really good GIF that I think we posted around launch of it just like paddling past the screen using its legs.
Yeah, and I think we can kind of see that. So when you spawn them in, sometimes they already have the neural circuitry too, and so we can kind of see them paddling a little bit the way that a real cat would. I think that their legs are very bony, so they don't actually have a knee joint.
Yeah.
So they. It's not quite like a full-on walking, but they nonetheless they do pretty well, and I always enjoy that species.
I know we've had some streamers making
this one's
like humans as well.
Yeah,
I think Blitz has uploaded some to the workshop as well. So as we're kind of approaching, because it's 1:45 now, I think as we're sort of approaching the end of the stream, do you want to maybe show off some of the Aquarium Mode?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Kind of just show that sort of game mode. So as well as the kind of main mode that Tom's playing here, which is the kind of domain simulation. There's a creative mode which turns off the plant spreading and kind of a lot of the evolution stuff, and it's more you can just place plants down, like design. It's like creating a designer ecosystem and just having it kind of exist. And then there's also the aquarium mode as well, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, so I'll load up the aquarium now. The aquariums are also online, so you can, in addition to having an aquarium, you can also share your aquarium and you can tour other people's aquariums. And so the idea of the aquarium is it's sort of like a place to store all the best creatures that have evolved essentially in all of your playthroughs. So essentially every time you save a creature to your disk for future use, it also saves it to the aquarium. This is sort of a fresh one, so we'll actually see creatures spawn in. And so the aquarium is pretty big, so you can basically see every creature I've ever made. So some of these are test creatures, and they just sort of like peacefully swim around. There's a lot of different rooms. Another thing that's sort of nice about this is I'll get to show you some plants that we didn't actually get to see in game, and we also get to see a lot of the sort of variety of creatures. And that was one of the things I was kind of happy with for this game, is that you really do see like quite a bit of variety. I think like you don't just see the same like 5 species over and over again. Like there's I think a pretty fair amount of variety in the game. So here's some corals. I never actually got to show the corals in our game, but one of the things that I really like about the corals is that they do build up reefs. So they really like fundamentally change the environment. Like if you make a game with corals in it and then leave that running for hours and hours and hours, they will build up sometimes really huge coral reefs that will actually go up to the surface. A lot of times, like almost like towering reefs, and I really enjoy that. And they grow very densely, so that it almost kind of really does look like a real coral reef, like if you've seen just like a photo of one or something like that. And so there's several different rooms that you can kind of tour in this aquarium with different types of environments. So we saw a reef and we kind of saw a beach. Like over here is an abyssal kind of realm. For creatures that are more adapted to this kind of environment. And up here in this room is more of like a lagoon, a green sort of lagoon area.
And it shows that you can enter the tanks there as well.
Yeah, so you can go in and in fact, when you're in each individual tank, it is actually sort of like a little creative mode too. So like if you want to, you can actually like spawn in more plants. If I wanted to put in, some more red corals here or some sun corals or like these, you can actually adjust the aquarium to each room in the aquarium can look however you want, and then you can share that online, and that's like your unique little area with your creatures that you evolved in your rooms that you're kind of like showing off.
Yeah, so I mean, is there anything else? I know you said you had like a smallish kind of list of stuff to hit off. Is there anything else you think we should show or talk about?
I think that's pretty good. I'm sure there'll be like a ton of things that I've forgotten to mention. The stream went by actually faster, in fact, than I thought it would. So it really kind of just blew past me a little bit. But I feel pretty good. Like we hit on at least a good amount of stuff, and hopefully we got to show off enough of the game that. To sort of give people a taste. There's also a demo. If anybody wants to try it out, you can just try out the demo for free. It's a slightly older version of the game, so it's like the equivalent of the day one-ish launch day. So there is like a year's worth of updates that it doesn't have, but it at least sort of gives you like a quick taste of what the game would be like.
And earlier,
thanks.
I shared, I've pinned it on the Steam sort of forum. We shared the kind of roadmap that we posted back, I think it was about 10 days ago now, because the ecosystem's been in early access for a year. I mean, it had its little birthday celebration. We shared kind of the 2022 plans. It's kind of a work in development. We may not hit everything this year. We hope to, but it's kind of a large kind of evolving sort of product, isn't it? But if you do want to learn more, if you check out the demo and like that, but maybe you want to wait for a little bit, you can see exactly what we've got kind of planned and coming up. Thanks for watching, everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much for tuning in.
Yeah. if you head over to the Twitter accounts, which are linked kind of on the stream ecosystem game, we've got the Discord link there as well. You can kind of join the conversation. But yeah, thanks for watching. See you all later. Bye.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.